Are you looking for the perfect gift for that very special geek in your life? Well, after 10 years, we finally got around to setting up a page for Geek's Guide to the Galaxy t-shirts over at threadless.com. Big thanks to our logo artist Blake Reynolds for the cool designs, and to our marketing manager / my girlfriend Steph Grossman for setting up the page and selecting the various options. There are lots of styles and colors to choose from, so collect them all over at geeksguide.threadless.com. So that's geeksguide.threadless.com. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 392 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Jonathan Kay. He's Canadian editor of Quillette and a host of the Quillette and Wrong Speak podcasts, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, Harper's, and Newsweek. And we'll be speaking with him today about his books Your Move, What Board Games Teach Us About Life, and Among the Truthers, A Journey Through America's Growing Conspiracist Underground. And now here's our interview with Jonathan Kay. All right, so we're here with Jonathan Kay. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So in an article you wrote for the National Post, you said, "As a boy, I liked science fiction for the same reason all boys like it. It offered grand cosmic landscapes on which to project the boundless possibilities of my own life." So just tell us a bit more about how you got into science fiction and which authors you were reading.
So I think compared to probably a lot of people you talk to, I'm fairly ignorant of the different subgenres of science fiction. I had the normal boyish curiosity about sci-fi. I think unlike a lot of my friends, though, I recognized that there was a very strong melancholy and nostalgic streak that ran through a lot of science fiction. I think in one of the articles, I think you highlighted in our correspondence, Ray Bradbury in particular is that theme comes through particularly in his work. And a lot of the sci-fi worlds that you see created, some of them are aspirational, but a lot of them are worlds that just distort some of the anxieties we have about our own world. And so, on one hand, I enjoyed the Star Wars style space operas. In fact, I probably like those more because there was less emotionalism in it. It was just you can enjoy the adventure. And by the way, like a lot of boys, I also got caught up with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, which made a really strong impression on me. I love those books.
Yeah, and those are very melancholy for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so there's this God, I forget who said it, that life seen up close is always tragic, and seen from a great distance is always funny. And Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is about the entire planet being exterminated and everyone you love being killed. But but you survive and you go off and have adventures in the galaxy. So it's either a horrifying tragedy or it's the funniest book you've ever read. But to a schoolboy, you could just ignore all the tragic aspects and have fun with the plot.
Do you remember any of the other authors that you thought of as the sort of fun utopian kind of authors? I mean, were you reading like Isaac Asimov or Robert Heinlein or?
I was, and I remember Heinlein in particular I remember his books made me sad. And I think Asimov, maybe a little bit less so, but some of Kurt Vonnegut's writing, which isn't precisely science fiction, had that effect on me. I also saw a continuum between that and Edgar Allan Poe. I remember Edgar Allan Poe, depending on how people describe him, some describe him as a proto-science fiction writer. He certainly wrote imaginative fiction. And I remember reading The Pit and the Pendulum, which is, it's about history, or it's set in a sort of vague Inquisition era historical period. But the pacing of the story and the way it transported me in a kind of Game of Thrones way to this other universe reminded me very much of the way, say, Stephen King affects me. Stephen King, I think, is a great writer. He may be. If a great writer is defined as somebody who makes you want to turn the page, Stephen King may be the greatest writer I've ever read.
I mean, in this article you mentioned, you talk about how Ray Bradbury kind of made you lose interest in science fiction and space travel and fairs and stuff like that. Could you talk about that?
I wouldn't say he made me lose interest in it, but he made me aware that a lot of the stuff I was reading was escapism. I think the story, there was a short story of his that I highlighted in it. It was called The Jar, and it was about this really creepy exhibit at a local fair. Ray Bradbury was always obsessed with the sort of like the creepy local iconography of small communities, and there was nothing in it that was like, you know, monsters from outer space or something like that. But I remember reading it and recognizing that the effect it was having on me, like the effect of fear and like suspense, it was all based on the inner lives of the characters and in turn my own inner reaction to what was going on. And I guess I was growing up at the time. I don't know. I was a young teenager at the time. And it made me realize that, like, if you want to use literature or reading or writing to understand who you are and to understand the human condition, you're going to have to put away some of the formulaic genres like space opera and focus on the ultimate question of all great writing, which is, who are we? And science fiction can do an amazing job of that, because by locating people in strange environments, in a way it can actually accelerate our understanding of the question, who are we? Because when you create a new community or in a new locale, you can put away traditions and you can put away the enforcement of old dogmas and laws and stuff, and you can get to the heart very quickly of, like, what is it that makes human beings tick? Like, if we had to start over on a strange planet, what kind of civilization would we create? And you immediately, you can't answer that question by recourse to, well, this is how we've always done it, because this is a new community. But the most interesting questions you're answering aren't like what's in that cave or what's on the next planet. It's who are we as animals? What makes us tick? Why do we do things? Why do we fight? Why do we love? That sort of thing.
But in this article, you sort of say that this Bradbury story, The Jar, was so upsetting that you stopped reading Bradbury. So it's like you had this epiphany, yeah, but it was too much for you or something, or?
Well, it was depressing. I was dealing with my own stuff in life, like every teenager. I remember reading the Martian Chronicles. I remember Martian Chronicles is one of those books that, like, I remember the edition that I was looking at, like the cover had this super cool, Martian landscape. And I was like, oh wow, this is going to be great. It's going to be this exciting saga on Mars. And if you've read the Martian Chronicles, it's like it's heavy. And it's not light reading. And I think to the extent I was looking for escapism at that point in my life, because, like I said, I was dealing with a lot of the anxieties and ennui that a lot of teenagers are dealing with. I remember that Bradbury was a good writer, but he wasn't supplying it to me. He was interested in larger questions. And he also, like, the backward-looking nostalgic aspect of it also depressed me, because at that stage in your life, you realize, like, your childhood toys don't have as much appeal to you. You're growing up. You're not going to admit it to your friends, but you miss being a kid. And Bradbury's stories, a lot of them are just about lost innocence and lost youth, and the lost youth of societies and civilizations. And Orwell, in his way, was also obsessed with that sort of thing. Like, if you look at in 1984, the Pearl shop, where Winston and Julia, for a time, they go to that place. It's full of, like, old papers and old ornaments and things like that, obsolete things that people have no use for in a technological age. So those sad themes were kind of wrapped up in my own sense of getting older, and this youth that I was leaving behind. I realize the purpose of your show isn't to do psychological exploration, but for a kid, this is kind of heavy stuff. And again, exploring the stuff wasn't the reason I'd picked up these books to begin with, but they followed me into the reading experience.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, you say that you are not maybe as well versed in science fiction as a lot of the people that would appear on the show, but I mean, it is obviously something that means something to you at some level, because you've continued to write articles about it. I sent you the links for some of them, and you even talk about having this sort of argument with a stranger on the street about Ewoks. So,
oh yeah,
it's obviously it's bubbling in there. It's bubbling up.
Well,
somehow.
that was an elderly woman, and she voiced, I think, several of the Ewoks in I'm sure, like, what is by now a long forgotten animated adaptation of the Star Wars Ewoks characters. That's everybody's least favorite characters from everybody's least favorite movie in the original Star Wars trilogy. And she had made a good living doing it. And I think in that column, it wasn't about Star Wars. It was about how you can meet really interesting people. I think I helped her carry her bags from a market or something. It was a couple of years ago. But yeah, when I met her, she was a veteran voice actor. And I remember thinking, wow, like, in this weird way, this woman has inhabited these characters that, although they're not my favorite characters, they're, billions of people have seen these characters, and she got to voice them. It's part of. Sorry, go ahead.
But how the article starts out, right, is that you just pass her on the street and she's saying to someone, "Oh, your dog looks just like an Ewok," and you exclaim, "Don't you realize the Ewoks are what ruined Return of the Jedi?" Right? Is that?
Yeah, it was just. I think the butt of the joke, of course, in that anecdote is me, that I'm this cranky old weirdo who just picks fights with old women on the street, and I like to think that by the end of the column that I'd redeemed myself, because we had shared a few stories, but it is true that it's like saying that your dog looks like Jar Jar Binks or something. It's like this. It's this strangely. It carries so many cultural overtones, and I mean, I guess this is true of any cultural institution that has been around for years and everyone has an opinion on. Like, if you tell somebody that, oh, you're, I don't know, you're such a Ralph Wiggum, or you're such a Barney, or be a Lisa, don't be a Bart, or characters from Game of Thrones, or characters from pick your favorite beloved franchise. Like, you're instantly tapping into, like, with a single word, sometimes like Ewok, you're instantly tapping into this rich lore of memories and associations that people have. So it becomes this cultural shorthand that we all share. But we have to be careful with it, because along with that richness goes often very strong feelings about different characters. Like, if you use a Game of Thrones reference and you're playing board games with somebody and you say, oh, you're conniving like a Lannister, that means something, right? It means they're sinister and they're slimy. That's one of the reasons I'm fascinated by science fiction, is because with a single word or two, you can tap into people's understanding of the human character.
I mean, another thing you say about Ray Bradbury, about Fahrenheit 451, is you say, since finishing that book, I have never been able to watch TV without feeling guilty for destroying civilization. And,
well, that's an exaggeration. But, sorry, go ahead.
Well, but in your book, Your Move, you note that you actually don't really watch TV or movies at all. So, I don't know. There's something going on there.
So there is something going on, but it's also because I think I was in like grade 8 when I read it. And may I ask, how old are you?
I'm 42.
Okay. So I'm about 9 years older than you. Well, I'm 51. And I remember a time when, it's not that long ago, but many of my friends, and certainly my sister, a younger sister, would go home and they would watch 6 hours of television every night. Like, that was not considered an abnormal thing. You get home at 4 and, you have dinner with your parents. And if your parents weren't telling you not to watch TV, I know a lot of people who, they would watch like 40 hours of TV a week. And I have a particular memory of my sister just sitting there. It was a point in her life, she was like me, she was an adolescent, she was depressed about something. And she had that glassy-eyed look that was typical of the characters in Fahrenheit 451. And I remember being horrified by it. And the shows that were on TV then were much stupider than the shows that are on TV now. We all like to talk about the downfall of our culture and stuff. But if you look at the shows that are popular now, they're just much better. I remember my sister and I would watch shows like Happy Days and Three's Company, and we're supposed to be nostalgic for those shows, but when I watch them, they're really, really stupid. Even compared to like low-end sitcoms that exist now, the writing was bad. The plots were terrible. There was a book that came out, I guess, about a decade ago called Everything. God, what was it called?
Yeah, Everything Bad is Good for You.
Yeah, and if you read that book, you remember the author. It's like Stephen Johnson was his name or something like that. He had these diagrams that mapped the character relationships in a typical show from that. I think he picked Dallas, which by the standards of the 80s, early 80s, I think was seen like as a high-end show. And he, compared it to a modern show, and there was just a much denser character interaction these days. Which is to say that the shows back then were incredibly stupid. It was a non-interactive medium, and people used it to numb themselves. It was like drinking alcohol. And now we have a neurosis about how much we use our phones. And yeah, people use their phones too much, but at least it's an interactive technology. And TV was not an interactive technology. It was like Soma from Brave New World. And I had a terrible reaction to it. It's not like I never watched TV, and I still, I'll watch sports on TV now and then. But yeah, Ray Bradbury helped convince me that watching TV was a bad thing to do.
Right, and so you say that what you do instead of watching TV is you play these tabletop games. And I thought it was really interesting because you kind of say that you, and I can relate to this, but that you can't really talk to people, that you just get bored having ordinary conversations with people, but that if you play tabletop games, then you can interact socially with people for hour after hour and not get bored and stay engaged. I thought that was an interesting observation.
It's definitely true that tabletop games, God, they do a lot in my life for me. They're very mentally stimulating. I tend to play like war games and sort of high-end strategy games, stuff like that, which they kind of transport you in this artificial world, much like a movie. They transport you into this world of strategy, which is like totally divorced from the world you're in. It's like your mind is in a chessboard type thing, and I love doing that. And it is a social experience, but it's not the social experience that, like, this time of year I hate. Well, I don't want to say I hate this time of year. I don't want to be humbug, but sitting around, someone has a Christmas drop-in, and sitting around asking banal questions, and it's not the end of the world. Like, and that's part of being human, is we socialize and stuff like that. But it's not my favorite thing. And to spend an afternoon playing board games, you don't have the electronic distractions, and you don't feel like you're drugging yourself with the idiot box. But at the same time, you are being entertained, and it's a transcendent experience. Like, you're in another domain. You're in this strategic domain that's being dictated by the game, but you're interacting with other people. And then what happens is that experience becomes super real, like a great movie. And my board gaming friends, like, we still talk about games that we played like 20 years ago. I say, hey, do you remember that time we played this game, where there are like these incredible twists of fate that took place within the game? And that has, so it has a social function in my life. It has an intellectual function. I've now written a book about it, so I guess it has a professional and editorial function. It's become a huge part of my life.
I mean, do you live around the corner from a game store or something? Like, how are you able to play tabletop games that often? I mean, I have a hard time just getting people together, like once a month or something, to play tabletop games.
It is tough, especially so. I don't want to stereotype people by age, but what happens a lot of the time is the golden age for people for board gaming, or for any hobby, often is college or early 20s, when you have a lot of time. And then you have kids, or your job gets intense, or other challenges present themselves, and you don't have a lot of time for those hobbies. But then your kids grow up a little, and you're in your 40s or 50s, and you come back to them. So I'm on the other end of the curve, and I'm a typical board gamer. I played a lot in college, and now I'm playing a lot in middle age, and you have to work at it. Like, the game that I really love, it's this obscure game called Advanced Squad Leader. It's a World War II game. I have a chapter about it in my book. Like, there's probably maybe like 10,000 serious ASL players in the whole world. And so every year I just came back from Albany. We have a tournament there. I go to Cleveland every year in October for a tournament. In March, I'll be going to Copenhagen for a tournament. And even, I live in Toronto, which is a city of 3 million people, but there probably aren't more than a couple of hundred or maybe a couple of thousand like really serious board gamers. And so sometimes I'll have to go to different parts of the city to meetups. And although board gaming itself is a subculture, it's a subculture of subcultures. So someone who loves one game may not have any interest in another game. So of those couple of thousand people, there might only be like 10 or 20 who share my passion for a particular game. So you have to, it's like everything else. You have to work at it. You have to develop a network of contacts, and I've definitely given up other things so that I could do it. There's other hobbies I have that I've essentially, like, I don't play video games anymore because I had to choose one. I wasn't going to give up my, I'm a dad and I spend time with my kids, but I had to choose between which hobbies I was going to pursue.
Well, like this Snakes and Lattes place that you mentioned in the book, is that someplace close to you, or did you go a lot, or do you only drop?
So Snakes and Lattes is actually a very, I guess you could say it's an important institution. I think it remains. I'm not sure if it's still the biggest board game cafe in North America, but I think it might be the oldest single-purpose urban board game cafe. Like, it opened up, I guess, maybe 10 years ago with thousands of games. It now has like 4 or 5 locations in Toronto. It's become this huge thing. There's a Snakes and Lattes. It's called the Snakes Podcast. And the Snakes and Lattes business model became a model for people creating board game cafes in other cities. Although other cities still haven't caught up. Like, if you go to Manhattan, there are only 2 real board game cafes in Manhattan because real estate is so expensive. Toronto is kind of in a sweet spot where we have the high population density that can support a big board game cafe culture, but the real estate prices aren't so insane that it isn't prohibitive, although that may change soon.
Yeah, I just moved from New York, so I'm just curious, what are the 2 in Manhattan that you would go to?
Yeah, so one is called it's called the Uncommons, which is way down in the Village, south of NYU. It's on that street that used to. There's still one. It's across the street from Chess Forum, where all the chess shops are in the Village. And it's a fun place, but it's small. It's kind of cramped because it has to be. And then there's a place that opened up a couple of years ago, way up, 110th Street or something like that on the west side, which is a bigger space. But I actually went there last time. I was in New York about a month ago. It's like 80 or 90% role playing games. So I went. I forget which. It was one of the weekday theme nights, and it was almost entirely like D&D type stuff. There wasn't a lot of strategy gaming, but those 2, and I because I was writing an article about the subject, I asked the owner, said, "Are you aware of any others?" And he said, "Right now, those are the only 2 in Manhattan."
Yeah, because I'm into Dungeons and Dragons as well, and I would go to a place called the Brooklyn Strategist in Brooklyn, obviously, and then I lived in Queens, and there was a place called the Geekery there. Yeah, but yeah, not a ton.
There's also on 34th, I think, there's a place called the Complete Strategist, which is this terrifyingly overstuffed play. I think it's on the north side of 34th. That it looks like it's about one bad accident away from like the whole place going up in flames. It's like there's like 100,000 games stuffed into that, but it's not a cafe. And actually, if you go to that place, you can see exactly what board game culture looked like in the 70s and 80s, because they have this bulletin board, and the bulletin board is exactly what bulletin boards in like every comic book store and sci-fi and board game store looked like when I was a kid. It was like, desperately seeking opponents for Age of Rome, or we need a 4th for such and such, with the phone numbers written at the bottom with little hatched pieces of paper that you tore off and stuck in your pocket. It was they were like little messages from 40 years ago, and some people still live in that world. They don't want to be on the internet. It's part of the reasons they do board gaming.
Right, and I guess I hadn't even realized until I read your book how massively the popularity of board games had increased. I mean, you say that the sales in the US and Canada grew from 75 million to 305 million, so more than quadrupled from 2013 to 2016. Has that, I mean, a lot of times, when you're really into something niche and you really love it, and then if it gets popular, you're kind of like, oh, goddamn, all these posers coming in and stuff like that. Have you had any negative reaction to the board games getting so much more popular, or is it just totally great as far as you're concerned?
So I haven't had any negative reaction like that. I would say you're absolutely right that there's often a bandwagon effect when it comes to things like sports teams or bands or stuff like that. I'd say board gaming is a little different because the barrier to entry for proclaiming yourself a board game fan is to play board games. And unless you really love playing Power Grid, you're not going to spend 3 hours playing Power Grid. It's not, people don't just buy a Power Grid T-shirt and get a Power Grid backpack and proclaim themselves Power Grid fans. Like the price of entry is measured in the hours you spend doing it, and it's also, like I said before, it's a subculture of subcultures. Like, so this year for the first time, I went to Gen Con, which is in Indianapolis. It's the biggest board game meetup in North America, and I think it's the second biggest in the world. I think Spiel in Germany is the biggest, but Gen Con takes place in Lucas Oil Stadium, which is where the Indianapolis Colts play. And you think, oh well, that's there's no way a bunch of board gamers are going to be able to fill up a complex like that. But not only do they fill up the floor, but the AstroTurf grounds of that stadium with gaming, they spill out into all these additional conference buildings where there's all kinds of seminars and meetups and people selling stuff, and there's tournaments. And I forget the number. It's something like 70 or 80,000 people are there. Like it's a really big conference, and it's expensive. To get the badges. I remember I didn't get my badge online, so I had to line up for 2 hours to get my badge. It feels like you're at sort of a popular music event, and it's that level of thing. And yet it's different, because when you go to a concert with 80,000 people, everyone is looking at the same stage. Like, you're all there for exactly the same thing. You're all buying the same T-shirt. You're all having the same experience. You're all tweeting the same photos. Whereas those 80,000 people are fans of 1,000 different games. And once they get into Lucas Oil Stadium, they all go to their own little sub-niche to play with the 7 other people who came to play that game. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of their personality, but it's also like a Tower of Babel type thing where you go to the bathroom or whatever, and there's some guys dressed like a Smurf, and one guy's dressed like a pirate, and some guys there having a rules argument about Settlers of Catan, and like they're all ambassadors from their own little tiny little isolated kingdoms of dorkery, which is one of the reasons I like it. Like, it's if you're a social scientist or you just have interest in subcultures, everywhere you look there's something interesting. But I also recognize the fact that I love 100 different games, but the 100 different games I love are a small fraction of all the games that people are playing there. Like half the people there are there for miniatures. These games where you paint miniatures, and you Warhammer is an example. One of these games these play. I've never played it, but there's a dozen games like that, and they're huge. Like there'll be some guy there who's just using airbrush techniques and showing people how to paint their miniatures, and they're people who go just for that. Like, they love it. And I shoot me now. Like, I have zero interest in like spending 4 hours painting like a tiny little goblin so he can fight someone else's little goblin is just like my idea. I'd rather do macrame. And yet those people think that what I'm doing, some World War II game with a 300-page rule book, like, they think that's the ultimate in stupidity. So it's on one hand you say, oh yes, I'm here with 80,000 of my closest friends and we all love the same things, but on the other hand, you're also very different.
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned that I'm really into Dungeons and Dragons, and one of the chapters in the book is about Dungeons and Dragons. It's a chapter written by your co-author, Joan Moriarty. But she's sort of talking about how there was this huge moral panic in the 80s around Dungeons and Dragons when I was playing it. And then there was another huge moral panic around Doom when I was playing it in the 90s. And you mentioned that you're a fan of first-person shooters, and I was just curious if those moral panics affected you at all when you were gaming.
So Dungeons and Dragons, it's true. Now, the moral panic around D&D had a religious aspect to it because... this was the 70s, and it was around the time where the moral majority and the Christian right were strong, and anything that had to do with the occult or myth and magic, that sort of thing. I mean, you still see stories about that, right? Like religious Christians who won't let their kids celebrate Halloween and stuff. It's not entirely in remission, but around this time. But it was also tied up with heavy metal music. Again, this is before your time, but you had bands that, as part of their publicity generation, they would celebrate occult themes and occasionally, I mean, there were these tragic stories of these kids who would like take the lyrics to these songs seriously, and they'd draw pentagrams in the ground and kill themselves. Like there were some genuinely horrible stories. They were isolated stories, but it created a sense of moral panic, and to some extent Dungeons and Dragons got caught up in that. The video game thing was a little different. When when the technology of a standard computer was enough to support an FPS video game, which is around the time of the emergence of like the 386 and 486 technology for what PCs. This was, I guess, early mid 80s. Around when Doom came out, the 3D aspect created it's primitive by modern standards, but it created an immersive cinematic environment, and it freaked people out because you were in this kind of 3D world, and Doom itself, I got addicted to it. On the other hand, I get addicted to all kinds of games, so the fact that it was 3D wasn't special for me. But as with many things, a lot of the people, and the same was true of Dungeons and Dragons, the people who were going on 2020 and 60 Minutes and all these shows to talk about the problem are people who had no familiarity with the game, right? They were, middle-aged social scientists who had read reports about it, but they've never actually sat down and played the game. And so, yeah, it was the same kind of panic. I think in the case of video games, it probably is more valid. I know people who have genuine video game addictions. My friend, a colleague I work with, got addicted to Civilization. In Japan and Korea in particular, video game addiction is a huge issue. And I started to note... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, but the panic wasn't around addiction, which is maybe a legitimate concern, but around people becoming hyper-violent after playing the first-person shooters, and that just doesn't, that's completely at odds with all.
So that was Columbine, yeah. So that was a particular form of social panic that Columbine, of course I'm talking about, is 1999, I think. That was the, God, what are their names? Was it Dylan Smith and Eric Klebold?
Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris.
Okay. Yeah, okay, maybe that's it. I mean, that set off all kind. It set off. So if you remember, there was a goth social panic because they were supposed to be goths, but I think they turned out they weren't goths. There was an anti-Christian social panic because there was a rumor which persisted for a long time that they targeted Christians, and I think in the end that turned out to be false. It was rumors about the video game use and probably they did dabble in a lot of this stuff because confused, dark, whacked out teenagers, who are into nihilism and stuff, they'll latch onto anything that gives meaning to their lives for 15 minutes, right? And so they probably did dabble in all this stuff for a little bit, but it created whatever you were suspicious of in society. The Columbine shootings gave you the fodder you needed to go after that as being the source of all evil. But that was a very particular type of thing involving school shootings and violence and stuff like that. But it also morphed into something that was more legitimate, which to my mind was the video game addiction thing. The violence thing, I mean, it wasn't crazy to think that a person who was playing first-person shooter games 12 hours a day is going to become desensitized to violence. That said, there are studies that show that even very, very, very small children instantly know the difference between fake cartoon violence and real violence. And I think like even 2 and 3-year-old kids, if you show them a video of like Bugs Bunny hitting Daffy Duck or whatever, they don't care. But if you show them like the equivalent of like someone using a broom to whack like a real rabbit or something, they get very upset by it. So I don't think it was crazy to think that a kid could get desensitized to violence through video games. But I do think that there has been research to show that that's been overblown.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that, at least from my perspective, growing up with those two, from my point of view, moral panics, it really shaped my outlook in terms of just feeling like adults really had no idea what they were talking about, and just having a real aversion to people just, getting emotionally worked up before all the facts were in and stuff like that. And so that's kind of, I think led into my interest in rationalism and skepticism and those sorts of things, which is also why I wanted to bring up your book, Among the Truthers, which came out in 2011. And so I guess, could you just talk a little bit about, so that was sort of my journey into rationalism, or part of it anyway. So what was your journey into wanting to look into conspiracy theories from a sort of skeptical standpoint?
So for me, the story is kind of boring. I mean, I was the comment editor for a newspaper at the time, and among the 100 other emails I got every day, people submitting articles, were people who were telling me that 9/11 was an inside job. And I remember being really fascinated by it because I have an engineering background, and so I was able to like follow some of their theories, or at least the premises of some of their theories. I took some civil engineering courses, and my specialty was metallurgical engineering, which is germane to a lot of their theories about like the melting point of the girders and stuff like that. So I was interested on that basis, but I was also interested in the dynamics of the conversation. Like I noticed that when I did engage these people, I wasn't winning my arguments with them. I thought like, it's slam dunk. Their theories are so crazy that all you have to do is have discussions with them and you can show them that they're wrong. But it wasn't like that at all. They had all these techniques for putting the burden of proof on me and getting me all wrapped up in debating stuff that they had been researching for months. So they had all these factoids. And I remember being really interested in this. And some of them had it was clear that it had taken over their lives. And I was also interested in the effect of media. Like a lot of them had become radicalized through video, which at the time, web video wasn't a new phenomenon, but the ability of people to make fairly slick videos in their basement, that was a new thing. And it was also the era when I think it was like the beginning of the age when you'd watch YouTube, and after you watch the video, they'd say, well, if you like that video, you may watch this one. You may like this one. And people were sort of daisy chaining these conspiracy videos together. So I'd interview these people, and in the space of a month, they'd become radicalized not only when it came to 9/11, but 5 or 6 other conspiracy theories. And the reason was because they were being fed through these algorithms. This is long before people started raising concerns about this sort of thing, where YouTube was predicting what kind of video they would like based on the last video they liked. And so they weren't just being radicalized in 1 or 2 conspiracy theories. They were kind of like getting all of them all at once, and they became conspiracists. It just sort of dominated the way they thought about the world. And I found that interesting, and that's why I wrote the book about it.
I mean, the thing that really grabbed my attention about this book was that you have this sort of taxonomy of conspiracy theorists, and obviously we don't have time to go into all the details, but I just want to read this list. So you have the midlife crisis case, the failed historian, the damaged survivor, the cosmic voyager, the clinical conspiracist, the crank, the evangelical doomsayer, and the firebrand. And I just think it's interesting that those categories exist. And I was just curious, did you come up with all those categories? Were you drawing on anyone else? Was there any, ambiguity, or like you had to decide, do I want this many categories versus this many, or anything like that?
So this chapter is basically why I wrote the book. The other stuff in the book I found interesting, but when I wrote the book, people encouraged me to organize the book according to conspiracy theory. They'd say, why don't you have a chapter on the Illuminati and a chapter on anti-Semitism and a chapter on the Freemasons or birthers? And And some of the other chapters do loosely follow that. But I realized early on that that wasn't really the most interesting thing going on, because the most interesting question I wanted to answer is, what psychological need do these conspiracy theories fill for people? And earlier in this conversation, we were talking about how the most interesting kind of science fiction, or any kind of fiction, answers that basic question: who are we? They look inside. They look inside us. And conspiracy theories, superficially, the reason people are interested in conspiracy theories, even people who aren't conspiracy theorists, is they like kind of the Buck Rogers aspect of it. Like, there are some exotic conspiracy theories about UFOs and the moon landing, and some of the more outrageous conspiracy theories about 9/11 involve lasers and holograms and stuff like that.
Lizards ruling the world.
Yeah, and that's David Icke and the lizards, and he's, for all I know, he's still selling out auditoriums with that stuff. But that gets old really quick, because they're just made up stories, right? Like, you or I could make up a conspiracy theory about any group we wanted. It's not that hard. What was more interesting to me is what is the appetite? Like, why are people doing this? And this chapter 5 in my book, this is 8 years ago I wrote it. I organized it according to what is the psychological appetite being filled. And at the highest order of psychological understanding, conspiracy theories, they're expressions of distrust, and they're explanations for evil. And we all want to explain bad things that happen in our lives and in society. And we all want a language to express our distrust with the institutions that fail us. Conspiracism is a sort of pathological response to that. And in some cases, it takes over people's lives. And I wanted to ask why. And so, like, for instance, the midlife crisis case, there's a guy, his name is Richard Gage, I think is his name. He's the guy who started this group. It's called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And he told me, I interviewed him several times, and he told me the story about how his career was failing, and he was just like, everything was going wrong in his life. And he was driving the Pacific Coast Highway, and this guy came on the radio and started talking about 9/11 conspiracy theories. And like, he had to stop his car and go to the side of the road, and suddenly it was like everything made sense. And then since then, like, his life had a sense of purpose, and he just like went around proselytizing 9/11 conspiracism. But it was like a classic, like, I know people in my own life who've gone through something like that, but it usually has involved, like, they leave their wife and they marry somebody else, or they tell their boss to screw off, and they go tour Europe on a bicycle or something like that. Like, they're looking for a radical break from a life they hate. And it's sort of this classic midlife crisis type thing. And there are some conspiracy theorists for whom that they're looking for something like that to free them from the life they're leading. And all of these entries in this typology, I tried to pick a paradigmatic example. And so Gage was the paradigmatic example I used for the midlife crisis case, if I remember correctly.
So are those categories stable over time, or if you were writing this book in 2019, would you have any different categories?
I mean, one of the reasons why I continue to be surprised that people interview me about this book and cite this book is that I find this book very dated. I wrote this book, as I said, it got published 8 years ago. And since then, like, a lot has changed. I have a big chapter on the internet, and had this book been written 20 years ago, it would be even more dated, because the internet is such a big part of it. But even in regard to the internet, things have changed, because I think people who counter conspiracy theories, people who debunk conspiracy theories, they have become more organized on the web. So if I wrote this book now, I'd probably have another chapter about how, although there was a lot of social panic, and I bought into some of it, about how the internet was going to become a source of conspiracy theories, or at least a leading propagation method for conspiracy theories. I think now, if you look at the downfall of Alex Jones, or maybe downfall is the wrong word, but like, there are many sites that have dedicated themselves to exposing Alex Jones. And especially after He started going after parents of the Sandy Hook kids. Those are the kids who were killed. God, wasn't it Lanza? I think was his name.
Adam Lanza.
Yeah, so that was a case in which Alex Jones really overstepped, and what he did horrified people. And the campaign against him, to a large extent, was based on the internet. So you have so that's one aspect that things have changed. But another aspect that things have changed in the age of Trump is that, my book was written about people who believe conspiracy theories. A lot of the conspiracism you see now is what I would call performative conspiracism. A lot of the people who support Trump, liberals are horrified because they'll tell pollsters, or they'll go on social media and say, oh, I don't believe anything about Ukraine, or I don't believe anything about Russia. And I think in a lot of cases, they actually do believe it. They're denying the truth as a form of tribal attestation to say, I love Trump so much that I'm going to publicly say that the accusations against him are nonsense. Because on a moral basis, I think Trump is good for America. And on a moral basis, I prefer him being my president than anyone in the Democratic Party. So as a gesture of support, I'm going to go on Twitter or Facebook and say that the accusations against Trump are bullshit, even though I kind of know that they're not bullshit. Like, Trump's done a lot of shady stuff. And it's very difficult to measure, because what I'm alleging here is that people are being insincere. They're being performatively insincere as a political gesture to express support for someone they like. But by the nature of the phenomenon, you can't measure it, because that's the thing about insincerity, right? People aren't going to tell you, oh yeah, I'm just being insincere. But that's probably a chapter I would add in the book now, is that a lot of conspiracism is now essentially a form of tribal political attestation. Because one way social media has changed politics in America is ordinary people can be part of the performance. They may not feel like they can influence politicians. They still have that frustration that they feel they're not represented in Washington or their state capitals, but they at least feel like they can stick it to the liberal media or the conservative media by saying things that they know bother them. New York Times reporters have Twitter accounts, and the reporters will say, oh, I can't believe that 45% of Americans believe this, or 60% of Americans believe this. And if you're some average voter in a red state, you see how annoyed these people get by statistics showing that, X number of Americans don't believe the allegations in regard to Ukraine or whatever. And so as an ordinary person, you can become part of the performance. And part of the performance sometimes means going on social media and expressing your support for things that you know aren't true, but you're just doing it to poke someone in the eye. And that's not something I really talk about in the book. I talk about conspiracism as a problem of credulity. I don't talk about it in its modern form, which often has a performative, insincere aspect to it. That's new. That's something that's an artifact of saturation social media usage.
Well, when you talk about people not necessarily believing the things they're saying, I mean, it's always struck me as really strange when religious people will say like, like heaven is the best thing that could ever happen to you and hell's the worst thing that could ever happen to you, and living by the Bible is going to make the difference. And you say, well, but you're having premarital sex and that's against the Bible. And they're like, yeah, like whatever, and it's like there's this huge disconnect between what they say they believe and how they actually act. And there's an example of that in the book where you say, one of the great ironies of the truth movement is that its activists typically hold their meetings in large, unsecured locations such as college auditoriums, even as they insist that government agents will stop at nothing to protect their conspiracy for world domination.
Right. They compartmentalize. That, I think, is a little different because there is a certain amount of compartmentalization that even the most sincere and rabid conspiracy theorist has to do to make life livable. If you really believe that the government is trying to kill you and the water is full of poison and the very air around you is full of harmful electromagnetic radiation, et cetera, then you'll never leave the house and you'll just be curled up in a fetal position, or you'll move to another country. And if you're not willing to do that, you have to operate in society, which means you have to compartmentalize. And compartmentalizing is a kind of survival strategy for people who have radical ideas, including radically religious people. Because as you say, it's impossible to live your life according to the dictates of Leviticus, right? If you accidentally have sex with a menstruating woman, you get killed. It's impossible. You can't live your life that way. So there is a certain kind of compartmentalization that even sincere conspiracy theorists believe in, but the kind of compartmentalization I'm talking about now is different. It's I would say a cynical, self-aware kind of compartmentalization, which is meant for performance. The compartmentalization exhibited by the people that I interviewed was meant for survival, like just to Richard Gage would fly around the country to give his speeches, even though his claim was that the government shot down 4 of its 4 aircraft and murdered all these people. It makes no sense that he would get on board a commercial aircraft, especially given who he is, but he does it because he has no other way of getting around to give his speeches. So he had to compartmentalize as a sort of professional survival strategy. The compartmentalization that you see now is more performative. It's done in a self-aware way by people who are trying to perform their weird beliefs in order to piss people off.
So this is really a question for Alex Jones, but I'm almost certainly not going to interview Alex Jones. So I'm just going to ask you, and you can.
I interviewed him. By the way, when I interviewed him, he was a nice guy and very charming, and he gave me a lot of time. And a lot of these people, and many of the anti-Semites that I interviewed, I'm Jewish, but I call them up and they say, "Oh yeah, hey, let's," they invite me to their house and stuff like that. They would compartmentalize too. I tried to take pains in the book to say that interviewing Alex Jones is actually a fun experience. If you ever get the opportunity to do so, you should do it.
All right. Well, I'll take that under consideration. But so, because I lived in Austin briefly back in the year 2000, and I used to watch Alex Jones on public access TV there. And at the time, I don't think nobody I knew had ever heard of him. I just watched him because I thought it was hilarious, because he's, just so out there. But he was always saying, like, the government's going to come and seize your guns, like, any day now. It could be tomorrow, And I would just watch this and kind of laugh. But then now it's like 20 years have gone by, and I'm just dying to ask him, like, what's the holdup on the seizing the guns thing?
Yeah.
Like, and I just imagine like all these guys that had this whole conspiracy, but now they're all retiring, and they have to like recruit new young guys and tell them about the conspiracy to seize everyone's guns. Like, I just wonder, like, how do you, what would the response be to that question?
Well, there's a very interesting precedent for that, which is the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses, who, as you probably know, is sort of a millenarian. They are. I guess they're Christian. They're theologically and doctrinally they're so radically different from mainline Christians that maybe a lot of Christians don't consider themselves Christian. They consider themselves Christian, and they prophesize the end of the world several times. And there are still millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around, despite the fact that there's a woman named Amber Scora, who's a former Jehovah's Witness. She just wrote a great book about her time. The book is called Leaving the Witness. If you ever get a chance to interview her, she's quite brilliant. And her book just came out. And I just interviewed her for my podcast. And she listed in her book all the times that they said, yeah, the world is definitely ending on this date. And then it didn't end. And you would think that the whole group would just split up. But they didn't. And the reason they didn't is because they originally bonded over these predictions and the theology and stuff, but then they end up bonding for cultural reasons. And those cultural attachments and social attachments and political attachments don't dissolve when the prophecy is falsified. And I think the same is true with conspiracy theorists, that they become very attached to these movements, and their whole political outlook and sometimes even their social lives revolve around this sort of thing. And so when prophecies are falsified, they find ways to reconcile that and continue the movement, because they're not willing to give up all the ancillary benefits and connections that went along with it.
My understanding is that with the apocalyptic folks, that they always say, well, the reason the world didn't end is because of us. God changed his mind because we were so devout. So you think that's what Alex Jones would say? It was the Alex Jones show that has forestalled the
No, I don't.
firearm confiscation?
So I'm not a faithful enough student of Alex Jones to know what his rationale is. But like he, if he's smart, he hasn't given any hard and fast dates. Like when the FEMA camps are getting set up, or when the guns are going to get taken away. In a way, Alex Jones has survived for so long as a conspiracy theorist because his conspiracism, it's not really right-wing or left-wing. Like, it's a sort of a general purpose anti-authoritarian conspiracism. He is identified as a right-wing conspiracy theorist under the current political typology we have. But a lot of the ideas he has about, like, big corporations and globalists and stuff like that, I mean, a lot of that figures into left-wing conspiracism. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he's one of the few guys who, you know, he was just as popular under Bush as under Obama and then under Trump. Because if you hate big companies and you hate big government and you're suspicious of religion and the media, it doesn't matter who's in power. You can fit that conspiratorial way of looking at the world through in any milieu. And because that is one of the universal elements of conspiracism, is that you distrust all forms of authority. And that often takes expression by hatred of mass media, but also, as I say, religion, corporations, government, including world government. Some conspiracy theorists get obsessed with their local government, and they spend like their whole lives litigating some property issue against like some local city councilor, and they're convinced that, you know, and then as a journalist, they'll send me 600 pages of files and stuff, and it's sad. I mean, their whole lives get taken over by it, but they're suspicious of all forms of authority at all levels and of all types.
I mean, one of the points you make in the book is you say that you kind of identified with some of these conspiracy theorists, you know, of the sort of obsessional character of this. And it's sort of, you know, you're saying that also a lot of conspiracy theories sort of impinge on science fictional territory. And actually, one of the people you met was an actual science fiction writer. I am not familiar with him, but Steve Alton, apparently the movie The Meg with Jason Statham was one of his books.
Yeah.
But could you just talk about that, about, you know, to what extent is there an overlap between geeks and conspiracy theorists, and what determines whether you fall down that rabbit hole as a geek or not?
So I remember very much where I was when I met Steve Alton. I remember the book was called, I think the book was called Meg. It was about this giant prehistoric, like super shark that goes around eating things. And he showed up this was 2009, and I'd gone to New York City to report on the 9/11 truther movement. And it was at a church in the Bowery, and someone got up. Actually, I remember exactly who it was who got up. There was an anti-Semitic truther who got up and started putting up all these slides showing how the U.S. government and the media is controlled by, he didn't say Jews, he used euphemism. He said, it's so stupid. He said, American-Israeli dual citizens, which was like, so it was his really long, obvious code word for Jews. And it was like a standard thing where it was like a flow chart, and I think some people in the room were into it, but Alden, to his great credit, like he got up during the Q&A and he said, like, this is bullshit. This is just like anti-Semitic nonsense. And I'm suspicious of the U.S. government in regard to 9/11, but I didn't come here to listen to standard anti-Semitic tropes. And he like said that to the whole room. I was super impressed. And I think I had interviewed him before, but the guy who had given his speech, who gave the anti-Semitic speech, he's a guy who wrote for a website. I'm not sure if it's still around. It's called Veterans Today. It's, despite the patriotic name, it's just like this garbage anti-Semitic site. And I'd interviewed him too, and I knew both of them. And somehow, like after the guy's speech, he got off the podium and started arguing with Steve, and I got like roped into it because I think they saw me as sort of like an honest broker, and I happen to be Jewish, and I think Steve might be Jewish too. It was just this totally weird scene But I think if I remember correctly, like in the book, I wrote in an upbeat way because I was heartened by the fact that 50 years ago, it was just taken for granted that many conspiracy theorists were anti-Semites. And it is true that even today, a lot of conspiracy theorists are anti-Semites. But in that room, like, there were a lot of people who were like, no, anti-Semitism is not cool. Like, yes, George Bush and Dick Cheney blew up the World Trade Center on behalf of our lizard overlords, but anti-Semitism is not cool. And that was like, for Jews, that's a win. That even these people who were in this like really fringe movement, they had no time for that. I shouldn't exaggerate. Like, this guy was permitted to spend 20 minutes spouting anti-Semitic bullshit, but he got called out on it, and I was happy about that.
But so you don't have any other thoughts on how you didn't end up going down that path, or other, geeks don't end up going down that path?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the other aspect of your question about geeks. So one thing I say in the book is that there is very much a difference between men and women when it comes to conspiracy theories. And it is, trigger alert. I'm about to talk about stereotypes. Men tend to go in for conspiracy theories that have like a strong technological aspect. Moon landing conspiracy theories are not popular. I actually encountered very few of them, but it tends, to the extent that people got into it, there was men in particular got into that. Men got into JFK stuff because of the ballistics and the guns and stuff like that. 9/11, a lot. Yeah, it's sort of, missiles and fighters being scrambled at Langley Air Force Base. Like, there is a sort of born conspiracy type thing going on. Women are also conspiracy theorists, just like men, but statistically speaking, from what I could tell, it was more medical conspiracy theories. It was more body integrity issues, vaccines, GMOs, food additives. By the way, these are things that a lot of people are concerned about, not just conspiracy theorists, but they kind of took it to a higher level. Alien abduction conspiracy theories, not a huge genre, but a lot of it involved women. There was sort of like a ravishment fantasy kind of stuff going on sometimes. But a lot of it often had to do with their kids. So like autism, vaccine autism, junk science, and conspiracy theories, women are disproportionately involved in that kind of thing, in part because it involves protecting their kids. And because often mothers are much keener observers of their kids' behaviors. And when their kids don't meet behavioral expectations set by pediatricians, it's typically the woman who monitors that. So women are much more into those kind of conspiracy theories, where men are tend to be into the sort of like the adolescent, juvenile, like kind of third-rate science fiction conspiracy theories involving guns and lasers and stuff like that. So there's that overlap on the male side.
Well, yeah. I mean, you say in the book that a lot of the conspiracy theorists are like something out of a Hollywood movie, and that a surprising percentage of conspiracy theorists actually refer to Hollywood movies to explain,
yes,
dramatize their theories.
Yeah, so including, there's one metaphor in particular, I think I mentioned in the book, is the red pill, blue pill thing from The Matrix. I think it's from The Matrix, right?
Yeah,
it's where, yeah. So that is really popular, and actually, it's now become part. I wouldn't say it's part of mainstream political parlance, but as an idiom, it has jumped over, I think, to certain forms of political discourse. But the idea was that the conspiracy theorists considered themselves people who had the moral courage to face the truth of the dystopia we live in. And I always forget which pill it is, the red pill or the blue pill, but whichever pill...
The red pill is the one that reveals the truth.
Okay, so then they're red pill eating people who have the courage. They're like, give me the red pill, I can handle it. Whereas people like you and me are sheeple who take the blue pill because we want to live in a world of lies, which are comforting. And this isn't just a dominant metaphor, it's also a form of self-aggrandizement, because it creates this distinction between people who have moral courage and those who don't. There were also others, cinematic references you would see. One thing that was really interesting is I someone actually wrote an academic paper about this, is conspiracy theories involving aliens who abduct people. And often, you know how they're often described, the aliens kind of look like giant fetuses. Like they look like, they often have very childlike properties. And part of the reason for that is because we have this sort of myth that like children have all this ancient, or this wisdom to impart to us. It's like baby Jesus type stuff. And some of these theories involve like the aliens coming to warn us about nuclear war or something. And they're these like very, God, what's the word? They're untainted by the sort of worldly evil that we know here on Earth, and so they're depicted as babies. But they also look a lot like the way kids look in ultrasound. And historically, these reports of aliens looking like fetuses began around the time that ultrasound technology became popularized, and women started being able to see what kids look like inside their stomach. And that was around the time that aliens started looking like those kind of fetuses. And it was also around the time that people started reporting that they were getting probed by aliens, because a lot of, gynecological examination and other forms of public health were involved probing and stuff like that. And it all got wrapped up in the body integrity issues that people have. And some of that is clinical. Like if a very popular, well, I wouldn't say popular, but people who are afflicted with schizophrenia, a lot of their delusions are based on body integrity. So, someone's replaced a tooth with a radio, or someone is secretly spiking their food. We, as human beings, we have, for evolutionary reasons, we're paranoid, and rightly paranoid, about body integrity issues. You could eat the wrong berry and die. And so this is something that resonates with us already. But people with mental health issues, or people who have strong forms of conspiracism, they take that to another level, and it dominates their life.
It seems like the conspiracy theorists, they also have this very Hollywood image of spies and what spies do, where they're always, assassinating people and hijacking planes and stuff like that, when instead of, going to foreign countries with suitcases full of money and trying to bribe people who hate their jobs to tell them secrets. It
right.
is very Hollywood.
Well, they don't. Yeah, I mean, there are people. Well, there are people like me. Well, I guess I know a little bit about spies, and I wrote a book with a spy once. But when I was, say, 30 years old, if you asked me what spies do, I would refer you to a James Bond movie, because that's the only information I had. And so, yeah, they're no different from ordinary people who their knowledge of spycraft is based on movies. But I think one point I make in the book is that they have a paradoxically elevated understanding of the skill level of all these evildoers that they're writing about, because in their mind, these evildoers are hatching these incredible schemes, and they're succeeding at it, and they're poisoning people, and no one knows who they are, and they're blowing up buildings. Whereas in real life, it doesn't work like that. As soon as someone like Trump tries to extract a favor from someone in Ukraine, it becomes the subject of impeachment hearings. People are really bad at keeping secrets, and they're really bad at poisoning people. And how many times did the U.S. government try and kill Castro? Right? It's like every second Thursday they sent him something. There's all these, like, it was like out of Daffy Duck or something, where they're sending him exploding cigars or whatever. I don't even know if they really did that, but it's hard to carry out even just killing someone. Like the newspapers are full of these stories of husbands trying to kill their wives, or vice versa, and they try and buy a gun and they're immediately arrested and stuff. Like, crime is hard, and yet when you read these conspiracist tracts, it comes off as easy. And the only place where it actually is easy is in Hollywood and in science fiction novels and stuff. So they have a very shallow understanding of how hard it is to actually pull off the conspiracies that they're imagining.
Right. Well, you give these 5 characteristics in the book of a conspiracy: singularity, evil, incumbency, greed, and hypercompetence. And I thought this was really good, because you make the point, we think of conspiracy theories as being just, 9/11 truthers or UFO abductions or stuff like that. But you say that, I mean, conspiratorial thinking is pretty widespread in people, and that any time that you start believing that there's some large group of people and they're all evil and they're all greedy and they're all working together and they're always accomplishing everything they want to accomplish and they control all the levers of power and they're working against you, that describes a lot of a lot of patterns of thought that people fall into pretty habitually, in all sorts of realms of thought.
Sure. It pretty much dominates the way a lot of people think about politics. I mean, look at the title of Ann Coulter's books. They're, off the top of my head, I think, God, was it like betrayal, deceit,
treason. Yeah,
it's all about, and it's not like about four people. It tends to be about how an entire side of the political spectrum is engaged in this monstrous scheme to destroy the country. Now, she wouldn't use terms like that, and I've heard Ann Coulter on the radio, and she's not stupid, and she has said smart things, and I don't think she's like Alex Jones. But the tribalistic way that she talks about people who she disagrees with falls very much into the category of black and white tribalism. And it's definitely the case that there are people on the left side of the spectrum who do the same thing. And, I see it here in Canada. Canada is an interesting case study because there's actually like very little difference between the substantive campaigns of like the liberals or the conservatives, or we have a party here called the New Democratic Party, and I won't bore you with the details of Canadian politics, but like the spectrum of allowable policy discussion is pretty narrow. And yet by the time election comes, we use exactly the same kind of demonizing discourse that Americans do. And people talk about Justin Trudeau and his conservative opponent in the last election who just stepped down. His name is Andrew Scheer. They're both, I've met both these, they're both nice guys. I wrote a book with Justin Trudeau. He's like, I don't love all his policies, but he's a nice guy. He's not trying to build a Death Star or infect everyone with autism, or, like he's just this guy who happens to be on the left side of the spectrum. And yet when you talk to people, it became an actual mainstream talking point in conservative Canadian politics that Justin Trudeau wanted to destroy Israel, or that at the very least he was indifferent to the continued existence of Israel because he differed with his predecessor Stephen Harper on certain elements of Middle Eastern policy. By the same token, it became a mainstream talking point among progressives that Andrew Scheer, the conservative leader who ran the last election, that he wanted to deny every woman in Canada the right to abortion, and that he wanted them barefoot and pregnant in some kind of like atavistic reversion to gender roles from 100 years ago. Like, these smart people I know started to believe these things, or at least said these things. I don't even know if they believe these things. Again, it became performative. Social media means that I'm not even, as absurd as these things are, I'm not even sure if I trust that these people actually believe them, or if they simply knew that by putting these things on social media, it was a way of waving the flag for their political tribe. And social media that's one way social media has changed things. We focus on the way social media changes things in terms of people now believe terrible things. But I think there needs to be more focus on the fact that I'm not even sure a lot of these people believe all this stuff. They just use it as ammunition for their own performances, because social media isn't just a way to intake information. It's a way to peacock your own political affiliations.
You quote an editor in the book when you're writing this Among the Truthers, and he tells you debunking books don't sell.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, did your experience bear that out, or did your book perform better than
my book performed fine. But the editor was absolutely right. If you're this person who's like, oh, everyone's so stupid and I'm so smart, and let me explain why the Twin Towers couldn't have been brought down by internal demolition in the way that these crazy people think, and oh, look, here's proof that Barack Obama is really a U.S. citizen, despite the fact that you haven't seen his long-form birth certificate. Like, no one wants to read that. In fact, I wouldn't want to read that, because you're just this smarmy guy at the dinner party explaining why everybody else is stupid. And he was right when he told me that. And it's also the case that it's not like these conspiracy theorists don't have access to information that debunks all this stuff. Like, they know how to use Wikipedia, right? They're not stupid. And they have friends who are only too willing to explain to them why they're wasting their lives on this stuff. So this editor was absolutely right that debunking books don't sell and they're not useful. And it also, I think in the final analysis, wasn't a book that would have been interesting for me because I kind of just would have been copying down information that's publicly available, like from, for instance, the 9/11 Commission report. What I like to think was much more valuable was actually sitting down and talking to conspiracy theorists and not stigmatizing them and realizing that a lot of the way they look at the world, we're always in danger of looking at the world in that way ourselves, and trying to organize them from a psychological perspective and what needs do they have that these things fill, as opposed to, oh, look, they're so kooky. The book, it wasn't a bestseller by any means. I think it did respectably. What was interesting is I went on so many national public radio programs. Like I went so many cities they wanted me on. It's exactly the kind of book that NPR listeners want to. They like to know that the book exists. I'm not sure how many people would actually read it, but I met so many people who are like, oh, I got to give your book to my uncle, or I got to give your book to my ex-wife, or I got to give your book to my boss, or like. Everyone I met, they didn't need the book, but they were convinced that like the crazy person in their life. But of course, that person had no interest in reading my book. So that's one of the reasons I didn't get rich off the book. But I'm really glad I wrote it. It was if only for the fact that it taught me the warning signs of when this thinking begins to infect my own consciousness. Because I spent a lot of my time writing and a lot of my time editing. And I now, when people pitch me articles now, I can see when they start to like go down that road. And I'm like, I could spend a month wasting my time editing this until I realize that it's nonsense. But now there's sort of like early warning bells. And at the same time, I can't let those early warning bells go off too early, because then you just become this person who's not willing to entertain any challenge to conventional wisdom. And that's not good either. Like, that's why the word skeptic has a double meaning. Like, a skeptic is either the crazy person who's a conspiracy theorist. That's radical, sometimes radical skepticism is like that. But the skeptic is also like, Galileo or Copernicus or, the first person who discovered, every medical discovery we have, who just looked at the world differently. And so it's a constant balance, and writing that book helped me think about where that balance is.
Yeah, and you sort of say in the book that once someone is into a conspiracy theory, it's pretty much a lost cause at that point, that you really have to get people before they fall into the conspiracy theories and sort of train them to spot these patterns. And you say that actually something you think would be really good would be if students were just taught about like the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Holocaust denial movement, and just these sort of uncontroversial conspiracies or false things, and then they could hopefully generalize from those examples to other conspiracies that they would come across. Have you has anyone done that, or is there any traction in that direction?
So I mean, I think it's a good idea in theory, and the problem is, because when I wrote the book, my kids were like 4 and 6, and now my kids are like 13 and 15. And I have great kids. I love them. But at that age, if you tell a kid up, they'll say down. If you tell a kid left, they'll say right. And if you give a kid the protocols of the Elders of Zion and say, here's an example of a horrifying thing you shouldn't believe, there's going to be something, not because they're anti-Semitic necessarily, but just because they're going to be like, oh, so saying I believe this is a way of saying fuck you. And you're like, yes, exactly. And they're saying, I believe this. Like, there was part of me at that age that would have done that too, because adolescents are geared toward acts of rebellion. It's part of our evolutionary psychology. We mark our ascent to adulthood by sometimes in a ritualistic way defying social norms or striking out on our own, or to impress our peer group or whatever. And I don't know that there's any way to insulate people from this. So I like to think I had some ideas for how you could discuss this sort of stuff, but whatever the prevailing wisdom is, kids are going to buck it. And I see it now with my own kids, right? Like, or not necessarily my own kids, but like in their peer group. For the last 5 or 10 years, there's been this new wave of political correctness that has swept schools. And you already see like 15 and 16-year-olds from upper middle class left-wing families who it's like, they like Jordan Peterson and they're skeptical of the trans movement and they're, they put a conservative bumper sticker on the back of their computer because that's the way you express opposition to received wisdom. Like you just, for them, that's what it is. And I don't deny the fundamentally leftist trend in our culture, especially on social issues. But no orthodoxy lasts more than a generation in that kind of field because there's just kids challenge everything they're told. And if you tell them, whatever you tell them about conspiracy theories, about the protocols, about Barack Obama's birth certificate, 9/11, they're gonna find a way to undermine that because it's performative.
You think there's nothing really to do about conspiracy theories, or?
So I do think there is. So on an interpersonal level, when a person starts drifting into conspiracism, I always say, and I wrote this in the book, like, ask what else is going on in their life. Like that was the first question, and I think I say it in the book. When someone starts going off in a conspiracy theory, don't ask what, ask when. And by saying don't ask what, I'm saying don't just go ask for more details about it. They'll talk for hours about it. No, it's one of the symptoms of it. It is a sort of logorrhea. Whereas it's much more interesting when I say, "Oh, when did you start believing that?" And sometimes you get like really sad stories, like like there was this one guy I talk about in the book, and he believed that the war in Kosovo was like the KLA attacks, the Kosovo Liberation Army attacks that were caught on film and stuff. That was all done in a Hollywood studio, and it was kind of preposterous stuff. But I asked him, like, when did you start believing it? And he said, I started believing this stuff because the Western media was telling me that the Serbians were all monsters and the Kosovar Albanians were all angels. And, the Serbs lined up behind the Allies for the most part in World War II. And he gave me this history lesson. By the time he'd done his history lesson, I was like, look, I don't agree with you about KLA atrocities being committed in Hollywood sound stages. But it is true that I can see how somebody who was a Serb nationalist would be so horrified by the way the Western media was vilifying the Serbs that they would think that there's got to be some conspiracy behind it. And it made me think about the way the media was presenting the war. I don't want to victim blame here and say, oh, it's all. I still think that it's a crazy conspiracy theory, but it was a much more interesting conversation to have with a guy to say, when did you start believing this? Than if I just sat there lecturing him about how difficult it would be for NATO to engineer all these videos in Hollywood. Like that just wouldn't be a purposeful conversation. And the only way I was ever going to get to this guy and sort of change his mind was by asking, like, what else was going on. Now it sounds condescending, like I'm a doctor, like, well, what else is going on in your life? Like that, it is a condescending kind of thing. Like I'm objectifying his form of belief as a form of pathology. But there are humane, socially tactful ways of doing it that also allow you to educate yourself. And also people just like being heard. People like being understood. And even if you don't convince them, you can medicate their sense of distrust just by hearing them out. And that's just part of the social experience of talking to somebody who has a radically different belief from yours.
So have you read Glenn Beck's novel, The Overton Window? And if so, how does it stack up against the Da Vinci Code and the Left Behind series?
So the Overton Window, I did read it. And it's a really interesting book because it was, first of all, I don't think Glenn Beck actually wrote it. I think it was ghost written. If I remember, it came out like at the height of the Beck phenomenon. Because there was a period where Glenn Beck was riding really high on Fox News. And, but I remember what was interesting about that is in the book, there's a character, if I remember correctly, who's like, he's innocent, but he is vilified and he's followed around by the American security apparatus like on suspicion of being an Islamic terrorist, or I forget, like some kind of terrorist. And I remember it was really interesting because here's a writer for Fox News. Well, he was a broadcaster for Fox News, who was like, part of the plot was about the overreach of the post 9/11 security state and how it was imposing on civil liberties and demonizing people on sometimes like unfounded suspicions. I remember that was really interesting because that's a kind of critique of the security state that you hear from the left, and a valid critique, if I may add. And I remember at that time thinking that it was interesting how the right and the left, in their suspicion of big government, there is some common ground, because when it comes to criticizing big government, conservatives usually like will make an exception for security issues. Like they don't mind the big state when it's the Pentagon, right? But there was a certain radical honesty in Glenn Beck being a conservative and joining in the left-wing critique of the security state overreach. So that's what I remember from the Overton window, if I'm remembering the plot accurately.
But do you recommend it as a I'm just curious.
No, it's not a good book. No, it wasn't a good book, and I don't think I read the whole thing. Da Vinci Code, I read every word. And Da Vinci Code is a good book in the sense it's like a good crap book. It made me want to turn the page. And what was really interesting about the Da Vinci Code is it made me fascinated by the history of the Roman Empire, because I knew that everything I was reading was bullshit, but I wanted to understand why it was bullshit. So if, in case you and your listeners don't know, at the heart of the Da Vinci Code is this theory that there was this like true bloodline of Christ, which ran through something called the Merovingians, if I remember correctly. The Merovingian Empire, it's like briefly flourished in the 5th century, sort of like the very late stages of the Western Roman Empire. And I think like the descendants of Christ had somehow married into it. And that aspect of it, even though I knew it was nonsense, I wanted to learn more about it. And so in the years since I read it, I've like been reading obsessively about the Roman Empire. So Dan Brown, in his way, got me into that. But what was interesting about the Da Vinci Code, and I think it's something I read about in the book, is that on the flip side of conspiracism, there's often utopianism. So inherent in a lot of conspiracy theories is this sort of Garden of Eden story that we would live in this wonderful world of like, feminism and people would all get along and there'd be no war and stuff like that. It'd be sort of like an Atlantis. However, there's this group of people who, for their own purposes, for their own greed, instead they've fomented war and capitalism and all these things that have divided society. And if we can just find this group of people and hold them to account, then we can reclaim this utopia that is our rightful inheritance. And so even though conspiracy theories are really dark and have a lot of violence in them, there is a sort of hopefulness to them, because real life isn't like that at all. Like real life, violence and evil are just sort of random, and horrible things happen to good people and good things happen to horrible people, and eventually we all die, which is terrible. But conspiracy theories hold out the hope that if we look hard enough, we can find out this, singularity is one of the elements of the conspiracy theories. We can find out this like single cabal of evildoers, and once we hold them to account, then we can live in a world that has been stripped of evil. For David Icke, the evildoers are extraterrestrial lizards. For some people, it's Jews, or it's Muslims, or it's liberals, or it's conservatives. But there's always this hope that's offered that we're going to live in a purified world. It's a very religious idea, right? If only we can find who these people are and hold them to account.
Right. You make that point in the book that all these conspiracy theories have this Manichaean quality of this battle of good versus evil. And one of the lines I thought was hilarious is when you're talking about the Left Behind series. It's the Antichrist, I think, and it is named Nikolai Carpathia. And you quote somebody as saying, apparently the authors didn't think to name him Evil J Transylvania.
Yes, it's a great name. It's like, well, he's like the Malfoy of Well, I mean, I had the same response when I read the Harry Potter series to my kids, where the evil house is called Slytherin. Like, how ridiculous is that? It's one of my many critiques of Harry Potter, which I won't clutter your airwaves with it.
I mean, she did make $1 billion, so
she did make $1 billion. But I thought that was like a little much, right? That it's actually called Slytherin. The idea that there's a kid who shows up at Hogwarts and they stick the Sorting Hat on his head, and and the kids, oh, congratulations, you're in Slytherin. Like, even as an 8-year-old, you'd be horrified by that. But I'm really going off topic.
Yeah. All right. Well, so this is probably going to be my last question. But so you have a blurb on the book from Steven Pinker, and I was just curious if you know him, or did you ask him for a blurb, or is he a big board game fan, or like how did that come?
Oh, you mean on my latest book, the board game book?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, on your move. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So he and I are not best buddies, but he appeared on my podcast, on the Quillette podcast. I interviewed him about, so as I'm sure you know, he had this book about the Enlightenment.
Yeah, no, I interviewed him about it. So.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, he's exactly the kind of guy who would be great on your show. And then I went to a conference in New York a couple of months after that, and I saw him, and we talked. And I interviewed him about some other stuff, and he then wrote an article for me at Quillette, which I edited, and we fell into this dialogue. And he's such a polymath. I don't think he's a huge board gamer, but he's fascinated by the way board games and board game culture fit into his various other passions. He's also probably just the most famous person that would return my email, which is like, that's probably, if you talk to the marketing department of your book publisher, at the end of the day, that's kind of what they want. Is like, if you can get Tom Brady to say he loves board games, they would have put Tom Brady on that book too.
Have you ever played board games with anyone, any celebrities or anything?
That's like, it's like when you write a book of, a Hollywood expose, and they say, "Have you ever slept with Sharon Stone?" No, I don't think I've ever. That's a really good question. Have I ever played board games with a celebrity? God, no, absolutely not. Which is not. It's not a crazy question, because I know that like Bill Gates and is a huge fan of bridge, and he used to play with that huge investor, the guy from Omaha. What's his name? Warren Buffett. Yeah, Warren Buffett is huge. I know that on the bridge circuit there are some very famous people who play. I think like if you go to Gen Con, the people who create a stir when they enter the room tend to be like famous artists. I don't think there's any actual celebrities in the board game. That's probably like one of the reasons people like it. Is it's sort of like a flat celebrity curve. But yeah, I never even thought of that, playing board games against us. What would that be like?
Maybe you should email Steven Pinker back and see if he'll play a board game with you, so you can.
Well, I'm thinking like he's a smart guy, but I'm thinking more of like Julia Stiles, or like I'm thinking like real celebrities. That may have to be my next project.
One of the guys in the book, he says he has like groupies and stuff. One of the board game designers.
Yeah. So yeah, he's a fascinating guy. So he's a guy. His name is Phil Eklund, and it's true. So Phil Eklund is, if you should get him on the show. Phil Eklund is a literal rocket scientist from Arizona. Like, he designed rockets. And in his spare time, he designed board games. And I think eventually he got rich enough that he was like, enough with the rockets. He moved to Germany. And now all he does is design these like crazy, esoteric, amazing original games with names like Pax Renaissance, where like you're a banker during, the 1500s. Or High Frontier, which models the physics of rocketry. And he lives in a small town in Germany, and he's clearly like, I don't know if he's on the spectrum, but like he's super introvert, right? And then once a year, he has to promote his new games. So he goes to Spiel, or maybe he goes to Gen Con or something like that. And yeah, so like he is the board game equivalent of like an art house celebrity. He was like Woody Allen, 20 years ago, before the whole thing. So, and he told me, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, where like, he says he's surrounded by groupies. I bet, there's probably like 7 groupies, right? And they're probably like people like me who are like, oh man, let me tell you about this game I play. And they're like, they go through like a detailed recounting, or they ask them for,
well, he means surrounded like on a hex map, right? Where you only need like 5.
Yes, exactly. He's geometrically surrounded. But then he said, but then when I go back to my home, I have to like decompress in my room for like 3 days and like not see anybody. And that's one of the weird things about these meetups, is that a lot of these people are highly introverted people, but you're putting, 80,000 of them in a conference center together. And so it's like, it's an interesting social experiment, but it usually goes well. It usually goes well. Introverts are actually usually very careful about their social interactions, because they know that if there's conflict that emerges, they won't know how to manage it. So as a result, there's like a heightened sense of politeness and consideration at these places. You should go. You should go to Gen Con next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is great. This has been such a fun conversation, John. I think we should probably start wrapping this up. Do you have any final thoughts or any other projects or articles you want to let people know about?
So my next book, which is coming out next year, is a history of film exhibition. It's mostly about the history of film exhibition in New York City, but I talk about theaters in Milwaukee and Connecticut, and I travel to Las Vegas and California to do my reporting. It sounds like a boring subject, but as I like to think with the board game book, it has some interesting things to give the reader. So a year from now, hopefully, we'll be talking about film exhibition.
That's the title, film exhibition?
It's 4 generations. So I'm having an argument because my preferred title, the publisher said, was incredibly pretentious. So it's probably this is always a thing. Like my board game book was called Your Move, and I wanted to call it I Meeple, like kind of an iRobot thing, but I Meeple. And the publisher said, like, no one's going to get that. It's so stupid.
Yeah, I wouldn't get that, I don't think.
Right. It has to be a person who knows sci-fi and knows board games, so it'd be like for 7 people. But I really wanted to impress those 7 people. So this book, it's about 4 generations. So I found a family that's been in the film exhibition business for 4 generations, starting with their great-grandfather, who came over from Galicia in the 1890s and like opened one of the first Nickelodeons in New York City. And ever from that first Nickelodeon, they're still running strong, and they have like 300 theaters and stuff. And so I think it's going to be, the subtitle is going to be like a history of film exhibition in 4 generations, because the last 2 generations are still around, and I interviewed them for the book. So it's a history book, and it's fun.
All right, cool. Yeah, well, definitely looking forward to that. I really enjoyed these 2 books, Your Move and Among the Truthers. And so we've been speaking with Jonathan Kay. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jonathan Kay for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.